Preparing and preaching sermons is something many of us do or will do in the future. The question is always how. How do you write? How do you study? How can you practically make a rhythm and practice to get it done consistently? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today on Practical Church Planting as we share with you a 7-step sermon writing process.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and sitting next to me is Dylan Dodson, and today we're going to give you a 7-step sermon prep process.
We're going to do a 7-step sermon prep process. If you're in the process of launching a church and you want a step-by-step launch plan process, go to practicalplanting.com/launch and get our Growing Your Launch Team course. Highly practical, 100% money-back guarantee if it's not helpful for you because we don't want to waste your money. But if you're in that, 12 months or less out from planting and launching, check that out. There's a lot of good stuff there. Now, this one is a 7-step sermon prep process. We're going to talk through how I write sermons, and Brian will give some thoughts on how he does his as well, and kind of ask me questions as we go through it. I don't know how long this one's going to be. Maybe it might be a little bit longer than average.
Yeah.
I don't know idea.
Buckle up.
But this is, take it or leave it. This is not the best way to do it. It's certainly not the only way to do it, but sometimes it can be really helpful to hear what other people are doing, and then maybe you can add some stuff yourself. And so even in my process, a lot of it has been, I heard someone make a comment that they do this or that they try this, and you just kind of try new things and see what works. And so this is not a, you should do it this way. This is just how I do it, and you can, adjust as you see fit.
Yeah, back however many years ago, we've talked about this before, but what we recommend if someone is going to be new preaching at your church, like someone on staff or resident or something like that, to have them do kind of a practice sermon in front of like a small group before actually preaching on Sunday. And so that's what I did, or we did with me, like I guess four almost 5 years ago. And I remember sitting down to write what would have been my first sermon, because I didn't go to seminary, so I didn't have preaching classes or anything like that. And I remember sitting and looking at this text that somehow I decided on and thinking, what happens next? Like I had no clue what to do. And I didn't really think about it at the time. Obviously, like we're not the only ones that have ever done this before. Yeah. There's other resources out there as well. But for someone who's like who is either newer in the preaching game or whether you're trying to change things up, like I think something like this can be helpful, not just maybe for you if you want to try and change things up, but also as you're bringing people on to just not say like do it this way, or not that this is the definitive way to do it, but this can at least be just a jumping off point of a way to kind of get the ball rolling, and then obviously change things, tweak things to your own liking and things.
So if you are completely starting from scratch, hopefully this will give you some ideas. Hopefully it won't overwhelm you. And if you've been doing this for a while, maybe just something to consider and think about. You might find something.
Yes, and I'll add one more thing. If you're finding this episode or video or podcast, however you're listening to it, for the first time, this is going to be super practical. In other words, we are hoping and assuming that like you'll pray through it and seeking the Lord through this and things like that. But we're going to talk strictly about like what can you do to actually prep this. So just kind of trying to, subvert some YouTube comments.
A blank stage to a Sunday.
There we go. Okay. Here we go. Yep.
Here we go. All right. So the first step is knowing your series and your preaching calendar and your particular sermon. So one of the things that's not going to be helpful is if you're sitting down and not only not sure, you're looking at this text or whatever we're going to preach, but you're not even sure maybe what text to even preach. That is not what you want to have happen. You want to have this planned out ahead of time so that you can actually, get prepped on and start on what you're doing. And so a new city, we have our series or our preaching calendar. Typically it's anywhere, 6-ish months.
Yep.
About maybe we're ahead. Now, I don't know, like right now we're in the Gospel of Mark and we're about 5 months away from finishing it. I don't have like every single sermon text
like
blocked
passage,
out.
Yeah.
We've just found that when you do that and then you kind of tweak text around, it can be kind of confusing. So, but we know we're in Mark for the next 5-ish months, and we have like the next, 6 to 8 weeks of text, solidified. And certainly it's solidified before I get there. Now, there might be a week where it's like, this is a short passage. These two could go together. Like I could maybe make it longer. And so that I might not know for sure until that, Wednesday morning that I'm actually writing and all that sort of thing. But that's, that's an exception. But tip number one is to have it planned out ahead of time so that you know what you're preaching. What you're preaching when you're working on that particular sermon, that you're not wondering also what else am I supposed to preach. So
yeah, I think this also helps you as you're prepping the sermon to know kind of what's going to be coming. Like especially, we talk a lot about preaching through books of the Bible, it's helpful to know, like, hey, if this passage is coming up and might be a little confusing, maybe it's going to be addressed in a few weeks
Yeah.
down the road because this gets addressed in a couple chapters. And so that will help you be able to maybe say that we're going to address this down the road and not have to spend maybe a ton of time on it, or not just ignore it completely. But I think it helps to have a full kind of, vision of where you're going to be going within the
Yeah.
next
So
short
there
amount of
doesn't have
time.
to be like some people could be like a year plus out. There's no right or wrong answer other
Yeah.
than don't be the week of. Ideally, at least a month or two, have an idea of what you're doing. That's what we would recommend. And so the first step is knowing what you're going to prep or what you're going to preach on before you start prepping for it, and not be like, I don't know, have any idea what to say, or I don't have any idea where to start.
Yep.
That's not helpful. So that's the first one. That's also the easiest and the quickest one.
Yep.
The second thing we'll talk about is the sermon prep setup. Now, again, it's different for different people. I've tried different things. The setup I have now, I've done for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years now. It's probably like my one that I just do forever.
Yeah.
So I'll just really practically talk through how I do it. Brian, you can share yours or any
Mhm.
questions or anything like that. I, first of all, 2 monitors, highly recommend. The
Got
first
it.
couple of years, the new city didn't do it. And then I did it, and I was like, I'm an idiot. Last week, I was meeting with somebody at their office, and they have 3 monitors.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I was like, oh, bro. He's
I
like,
literally tried that the other day, but with the new MacBooks, you can't do that. You
Oh, you
can't do
can't?
a third monitor. I was trying to set that up. I almost bought one before realizing that.
wow. So I'm like intrigued by that, but then also like when I go from 2 and then I'm at my house, I just have my laptop. I'm like,
Yeah.
I can't do anything, which
Yeah.
I can. If I had 3 at the office and then one, I just feel like
Mm.
I would die.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I do is I've got my laptop and another monitor. On one of the screens, I have Logos. So we've talked about this before. I use Logos. You can do what I'm doing with the free Logos version. So I sometimes use some of the extra tools, but it's not for that. I've had Logos for forever. I didn't know how to use it. And then someone said, hey, you could use it like this. And this is amazing. So what I do is on one screen is Logos. It's full screen. And I have it broken up. You can watch YouTube videos on this. Like pretty much half of the Logos screen is my commentaries.
Mhm.
The other half, the top corner is various Bible translations. And the bottom other corner is just one Bible translation. And basically I have my commentaries linked to the top corner. So as I'm scrolling through the Bible, the commentaries are scrolling down, like if they're verse by verse or whatever, they're scrolling down with it. And then the bottom corner Bible is just there and not linked to anything, so I can scroll without moving my commentaries around, if that makes sense. I highly recommend it. It's awesome. I use Logos for my commentary, so I buy all of mine digital, and I have for the last couple of years. I mean, yeah, you don't have like the cool look at the million books in my office, but who cares? And you can do it anywhere.
Yeah.
I'm not one of those that typically, I mean, I guess it's cheaper if you buy like a whole volume
Mm.
commentary set. But what I do now is I just buy commentaries when we're in those books of the Bible and they slowly built up. And then I save it as a preset. So it's like a Nahum study, Mark study, Exodus study, whatever. As a side note of that, not having anything to do with preaching, if I'm ever like in a passage or trying to look something up and we've preached through that book of the Bible, I can just open up Logos,
Mhm.
go to the Bible verse because it's linked to the commentaries instead of opening about all these commentaries, trying to find the page. It's just super quick.
Yeah,
So I know that might
yeah.
be kind of confusing, but I think they're called presets. You can YouTube how to do those. But all that is to say, I personally like physical hard copies better than digital, but I've moved to this for sermon prep and highly recommend how easy it is. With that too, I think it's it's on this one. So people like commentaries and stuff. How you do? Here's what I've settled on. I just buy 2,
Mhm.
and that might be a lot or might be a little to some people. Like I'm reading this book right now, and he has like 6, and I'm like, goodness, maybe that's what maybe maybe that would make me take prep longer.
Sure. Right.
But I just buy 2, and I've got 2 commentaries, Logos. I've got my study Bible for like quick notes, and I've got Google. Now, right now we're in the book of Mark. I have a book on the Gospel of Mark by like Tim Keller. So like I'll read through that when he's like commenting on. He doesn't do all the verses, but some of those. But for a typical setup, it's Logos with 2 commentaries, the study Bible, Google. You could have a lot more. I mean, I've been doing this for a while too, so I kind of have a general idea on certain things.
Mhm.
I've just found like reading and studying is helpful. Once you start reading and studying a lot, I think you get diminishing returns, and it might be really cool. But if you're reading 5 commentaries, I think you're really tempted to have too much information, and it's not practical enough, and it's just too head knowledgey, and you're going to lose people. But if that works for you, do it. I just don't do it that way.
Yeah.
That is what my sermon prep setup looks like.
Do you have a leaning towards certain commentaries, or do you just kind of book
It's-
by book?
It's hard for me to know because somebody asked me this last week, and because they're all digital, like I don't see
Oh
I
yeah,
never
yeah.
see them.
Yeah.
What I do is a good question. Is I go to bestcommentaries.com, I think,
Mhm.
or if you just Google best commentaries, and they'll rank the highly rated ones, like whatever.
Yeah.
And so I'll buy 2 of the highly rated ones.
Yep.
Um, there are some like if you told me what they were, if you showed me because they're all color coordinated, I
Yeah.
could say like I use those more
Yeah.
than others. But I try to do highly rated ones. I've done some of what I've done for the last couple of them is like NIV has I don't know what it's called
Yeah.
because I don't
Application
an
commentary.
application commentary, which is more like big thoughts. So I've been for the last couple of books, I've done the NIV commentary because it's like big thoughts on the passages,
Yeah. Mhm.
and then a verse by verse one, and
Mm.
it's more broken down. But I typically just try to find one that's highly rated, and at least 1 or 2 of them written in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not because newer is better, but maybe some of the some of the examples and sayings are more modern. But don't just assume because they're newer they're better. But I do try to get at least one of them newer-ish if possible. But bestcommentaries.com, that's what I use. I don't have an answer on
Yeah.
series.
It's the
But if
best.
you're a series guy, that could work too.
I'll give what I do is very similar, and I'll give it in a second. But I do have one question of the way you do it because it's a little bit different than me. So like for commentaries, because that's one of the areas that I differ is outside of like the verse by verse portions. How do you use logos for like I'm trying to think of an example. Like a section of the commentary that's giving potentially like information on like the whole chapter before they actually get to like verse by verse.
Yes.
Does it link it still in logos, or does that get mixed up?
It does link it, but it like links it to like the first verse of that passage.
Okay.
So like if I'm doing like a verse by verse study, that doesn't help me because
Right,
you have to still scroll a little bit. What I'll do is a good question. What I do for the ones that are like the NIV, if they're more like they like take on a whole passage, not just verse by verse.
Yeah.
I highlight them in green because I like that color. I highlight them in green if there's things that I thought were really interesting. If it's really interesting, sometimes I'll copy and paste it and just put it in my notes. But if it's like I'm not sure I'm going to use that, I'll highlight that in green so that when I'm going and we'll talk about this, when I'm actually like writing what notes I'm going to keep, I can just scroll and find them as opposed to having to read everything.
Okay. So it's like having a paper book and highlighting it basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Same idea.
I didn't used to do that with like the big passage ones, and then I'd be like reading for forever. So if you do the digital one, highlight, and it's just easier to find stuff. So
yeah. What I do is very similar. I've for the majority of the time have used the goal was for me was one paper commentary, and if possible, I mean it kind of for me it kind of depends like how much I'm preaching in a book. Like if I'm doing one sermon in this series, then I feel like I shouldn't spend a lot of money on commentary, but like Mark, we're gonna be in for a long time. I'll do, I don't know, by the end of it, maybe 4 or 5 sermons in it. I'm more comfortable with spending a little bit of money to take care of that much. But what I've always done is, a paper commentary or paperback book, whatever, hardcover book, and, go through and kind of like you're saying, highlight things I want. And then in logos have it tied to like one other commentary, but that you can do that. I may change it up because we are looking to move, and I was looking at books and realized this is going to be a nightmare. And and I am young, and so as life goes on, this might become more and more of a nightmare.
Yep.
So we'll see. But
yes, you can highlight in logos.
That is good. So one little I don't know, pro tip, whatever, for logos is Logos has ways you can do things for much cheaper. They have free books of the month every month. And most of the time, you're probably not going to want them. But occasionally, I have seen, so like they do like free book of the month. And if you go to that page, it's like, here's a free one. And then add this one for $2 and add this one for $5. And like it goes on, and it's basically just like deals on a bunch of them. And there's been a couple times where I've seen shorter commentaries for free that are series that like I know of, that like I don't know if I would have bought it, but it's free, so I'll use it in case we're going through this book. Or I've seen ones that are much cheaper of series that I would have actually bought if we were in, if I needed it for that book. So there are definitely ways to get things cheaper, and they give you a $20 gift code, whatever, on your birthday month. Do you get your birthday month? It is your birthday month.
Yes,
right now.
it is my birthday month.
Yeah.
I remember last year I used it. I guess I'll have to check for the next one to buy.
I just did. My birthday month just ended, and I had to contact them because I never have like my email put in. I mean, my birthday put in, and they gave it to me. So there's like a full Bible commentary I'd wanted, and I figured it'd be easiest in Logos, and got it for like $9.
I know money's a thing, so like if you do have Logos, I don't use any of the pre-installed ones, or like Matthew Henry commentary that's like on like I just
you can get it anywhere.
If money's a thing, I would say just buy one and just start from there. But Googling is helpful, but also cannot be helpful because people don't always know. I mean, after you're doing this for a while, you kind of have an idea of like, is this legit or not? So Google, if you preach regularly, I wouldn't just rely on Google.
Yeah.
I would, invest in some commentaries that you trust. So that's
Yeah.
what the setup looks like for a sermon prep.
There you go.
Now, the third step is how do you actually write it? And this is different for everybody. I'll talk about what I do. Brian can share what he does, or if he has questions for me. This is where it maybe gets a little complicated. This is what works for me. Do whatever works for you, but take and leave whatever's helpful for you. So on Wednesdays, from 8 to noon in the morning is my study and write time. I have found that having a solid deadline is really helpful. So I very rarely go over this. Sometimes I do, like a couple weeks ago, but it's very rare. Oftentimes I beat it. Not that I'm like racing against the clock, but it's defined. I don't check email. I put my phone on the couch in the office. I don't look at anything. We talk about focus and productivity in other episodes, so I won't get into it here, but it's like I spend 4 hours straight. I mean, if I go to the bathroom or whatever, but that's what I do. I don't take breaks. I don't, whatever. I do it all at once. I have this where it's planned. I have the new deadline, and I've just found it's like when you go on vacation and you have a deadline hit. For some reason, you get 2 weeks worth of work done in 1 week because you were focused.
Yeah.
So that's what I do. I've put on the calendar. It's the same every week. I would highly recommend for you doing consistent sermon prep. Of course, if something comes up, you got to change it, move it, but that needs to be the exception, not the rule. If you preach regularly and you want to preach well, it needs to be prioritized and on your calendar. So 8 to 12, what I'll do is I will pull everything up on my screens. I'll read the passage, and so this is the one thing we were talking about before we started that I'm currently getting some preaching coaching on, and it's probably going to change. It is going to change. Some of it, not all of it will be, but maybe in the future we'll do an update just on this part. I'm also currently reading a book by Brian Chappell called Christ-Centered Preaching, which is phenomenal. It's like 500 pages, so it's a long preaching book, but it's super practical and really helpful, especially if you're a newer preacher, but even if you've been doing this for a while, some tips on there. And so he's really practical in it. So Christ-Centered Preaching, if you're looking for a book by Brian Chappell, highly recommend. But typically what I do now is I will, read the passage in my Bible, try to kind of get the idea of what's going on and what's being talked about. And then I will open up everything, and I will, because I, like right now, if I do like the NIV commentary, that's more like passage based than like verse by verse, I will read all that for the commentary, and I'll highlight and or copy and paste some things into my other screen is just my Google Doc sheet / my Google if I need to, or look up other Bible verses. And so I'll highlight some stuff and or copy and paste some stuff into there, but I don't really write very much, just kind of reading it. And then I will go to the verse by verse and use my study Bible and any other tools I might have and start making notes on either each verse individually or a couple of verses. It's typically, I mean, if the verses go together, particularly if it's a narrative, it might be like 4 or 5 verses or whatever, but it's pretty broken down just to explain what's going on here, not try to over-explain it. And I've been doing this a while. As a pro tip, I don't start with an intro. So if you're standing at your computer or whatever and you're trying to figure out, like, I don't worry about that. An intro story, an intro, I just like start read the text. And I've been doing this a while enough to where I kind of know we're like, hey, I've explained enough stuff. I need like a story and an illustration and a point here. And then I'll do a couple other verses and a point here. Now, typically I'll try to figure out, so these couple of verses, here's a point to take from that. And then here's a couple of verses and here's a point to take from that. And I'll do that a couple of times until I get to the end and then try to think of like a unifying, how did all this passage go together? And so my last point is never just, here's a point about the last few verses. It's like, here's how all of this goes together, and here's what you need to take away. This is the really simplified version. And then after that, I will go back and add an intro story, and figure out what would a good intro be based on what's the passage about or what's the main idea that I want to leave people with. And so that helps me kind of get to it. Now I've been doing this a while that I kind of know like, after it's going to take me about this many minutes to explain this stuff. People are going to need a break, whatever. Now, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you got to explain all the text up front, and I'll even say on those Sundays, hey, this is going to be a little different, although that is pretty rare, so it's not like once a month I'm saying that. It's like it is pretty rare. But I kind of know where things break off, and so I'll try to do a point. When I do the points, I'll try to do the points, anything I want to say about the point, and think of an illustration or a story that goes with it. I don't get a story or an illustration with every point. Typically, I might do 4 to 6 points in a sermon. I don't do a sermon or a story with everyone, but I try to do at least 2 or 3. Yeah. And so what I'll also try to do is if I can't think of a story, which this is where the most amount of work is, because they want to make it engaging. Like it's easy to explain what the Bible says, but you want to help people take next steps. And so I'll try to think of I'll write on the page story about this, and I'll try to think of one. If I can't, because we'll talk about this in a second, I talk through it with some people later on. I know this is not like the end all. I'm also, my Wednesday prep is not that week of, so I'm about 4 to 6 weeks ahead of time. I forgot to mention that. So what I'm doing on Wednesday is not the sermon I'm preaching. As a side note, I would highly recommend at least getting 1 week ahead if you can. I know it's different for different people, but if you can just get 1 week ahead, you're not stressing out on Monday morning when I'm going to preach. You know.
Yeah.
So this is a 4 to 6 weeks out, and I'll go through that. If I can't think of a story, I'll just say a story about whatever and do the bottom line, and then I'll go back and do an intro story that has to do with either the main point or just like an idea of the scripture. So like we just did our message collab is what I call it, or when I talk through the sermon for next week, and it's about Jesus clearing the temple. So we're thinking of a time of like any time that I experienced something that was like shocking or unexpected in public.
Yeah.
And so that's the intro story, and I've got a story about something like that. But I didn't start with that. I just read the text. What are the points? What is happening here? And then go back and start with your intro, and that can be really helpful. I don't currently use an outline, although I'm going to switch that a little bit. So I don't know, maybe in 3 or 4 months we'll have a little update on this.
Yeah.
But I did when I started, especially when I got off of notes. If you go to our YouTube channel, Practical Church Planning, we have got a free, you don't have to do email or anything. It's just like sermon prep. Like a
course.
Sermon course.
Like a video course.
Preaching course, yeah.
Preaching course.
And one of them is preaching with an outline and preaching without notes. And so I used to use that outline. It's really helpful. If you are new to this, I highly recommend an outline because it tells you what, it kind of gives you, here's what you should be thinking of. When you do it for a while, you're not really tied to that because you know what you're doing. But that's what that looks like. I don't know if, I know I kind of said a lot of things. I don't know if there's anything clarifying that could be helpful.
No, I think it made sense. I think it's good I think an outline's a good idea to start. It's, at this point, we don't use the outline that we talk about in that video series.
Yep.
But especially as, myself, someone who is at the time new to preaching, it made it so much easier to just wrap your head around where to start.
Yeah.
Because you could go, just about any passage, you could go in so many different directions with it. And, we obviously don't really recommend this here. And I don't think it's especially a good idea for like a newer preacher to like try and watch videos of other people preaching a certain, passages every week. I guess sometimes maybe it's maybe like trying to get how someone explained this, but like, especially when you're early on trying to figure out how to actually do this, I think it can be a little more detrimental to like watch someone else preach the same passage because you'll probably accidentally start copying exactly what they're doing. But it's hard to wrap your mind around where to start or where to begin. And so I think an outline of some sort is a good place to get a jumping off point. And then you can grow from there. You can abandon it completely down the road like we did. But it's a good place to at least get things rolling.
And one other thing too, I do, don't forget, is if I know like, hey, this would be a good time for a break or for a point, or it seems like there's a break in the passage, I'll put like a point and it'll just be blank because I can't think of one. And then sometimes, when we talk over the sermon, which is also something I highly recommend, we kind of realize, hey, I know this is kind of a lot of information or whatever, but you can get away without doing a point. And so we'll just take it away, or someone else might think of it. But I try to like put those in, even if I can't think of a point at the moment, I kind of put them in where they might be and just take it away if we can't think of something later on. So
yeah. So a few things that I do a little bit different that have helped over kind of the past few years is basically what I started doing recently is as someone who doesn't preach every week, you can, generally, at least for us, I usually have, month to a month and a half notice before I am preaching a Sunday because we're that far ahead. And so it'd be easy for me, and it always has been, this is kind of the way I've always done it, to, take a day a week or so to like work on it. And you have, as long as you can manage your time well, you can plan a lot more time to work on one sermon than you can if you're preaching every week, which is fine. And I definitely think, especially if you're newer, you should do that. What I'm trying to do now is kind of more of what we're talking about here, of just like a certain amount of time, if I have a sermon coming up, X amount of weeks out, because that's a lot more sustainable in the long run. Like doing it, if you're preaching your first sermon, spend too much time. Like spend as much time as you want because you're never going to be confident in it. But as time goes on, especially if you're going to be planting a church and you're a resident right now, maybe, and getting sporadic preaching opportunities, or if you're like a staff member, it's not sustainable to do that forever. So like as soon as you can, develop like a specific routine for sermon prep, which is what I'm trying to do now. But what helped me, especially early on, I don't really do it now, was manuscripting out a sermon. Now I don't do it now, and I never brought it up there. And I know people who we had one guy preach for us a long time ago who used to go to the church who brought a manuscript up to preach with him, and I was like, oh man, this is gonna be so boring. Like it was like a literal 4 or 5 page manuscript, and it was like, and he delivered it super. I would have never guessed he had a manuscript in front of him. So some people can do that well. I am not one of those people that could do that well,
Yep.
but I found it really helpful to manuscript out the sermon in prepping, just to
Yep.
really help internalize it. And as you do it more and more, I think that probably becomes a little less and less necessary. But especially early on, and obviously when I would do that, after that would be some tweaks and stuff. So that wouldn't end up being exactly what the sermon ended up being. But it really helped get a full grasp of everything that I was preaching. If you're not preaching through an entire book, but taking one passage, you're not studying the whole book
Yeah.
like you would be if you're preaching the entire series. And so I think it just helps you to know what you're talking about, internalize what you're preaching, and I don't know. I think it just helps give you kind of more of a grasp of the passage that you're going through.
Yeah. So if you don't preach every week, that is really helpful too, because if you have too much time, it's like if it's unstructured, you have too much time, you could spend way too much time on it.
Oh yeah.
So if you preach somewhat regularly though, or once a month, once a quarter, whatever, we'd also encourage you to, when you have a sermon coming up, put on your calendar of like, here's what the prep time is going to look like. Give yourself a deadline and just be done with it. Like, don't
Yep.
spend all this extra time on it. But if you were to, like what Brian was saying, I think that's really wise, is to figure out your own rhythm when you have a sermon coming up and know exactly when you're working on it, when you're not.
Yeah, and one other thing I found helpful, I got this tip from somebody else, and this is obviously different personalities weigh in, but this is just something that's helped me, is I'll type out the person I was listening to actually wrote by hand. I don't write by hand, but I type out the entire passage that we're going to be going through, like not copy and paste it over, but actually like, I mean, not like I memorize it, but look over at a Bible and retype it out and then kind of split it into verses and then go through pretty much in a similar way to what Dylan said of like going through verse by verse and putting in notes and things like that. But I found if I up front actually took the time to type it out, which for the majority of passages takes, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Yeah, like it's not long, but it helps have kind of a I don't know. And it kind of before it helped internalize it before actually going through and reading what other people were saying about it.
Yep.
Again, and that could just be a personality thing, but that is something that I read. I didn't know if it'd be pretty helpful, but I've actually really enjoyed doing.
So that's the prep. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful. Again, my recommendation is don't figure out an intro. Do that at the end and just start reading the text, start making notes, start to be proactive about, even if you're not sure what the point could be, like try to be proactive of when a point should be and what the illustration could possibly be. Part of what gives me the flexibility is I'm not writing on that Sunday's sermon, so I don't have to have it 100% completed. So I don't have to sit there and bang my head.
Yeah.
I do bang my head, but I don't have to do it as long because I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, we'll talk through this later on a later date. So that's what Wednesday morning looks like for me. If I really had to give the sermon, I could. It wouldn't be great, but it's done.
And another thing that's been helpful to me is like in going through prepping it, like you said, not trying to think of stories or illustrations or whatever right then. But sometimes you do on accident,
Yeah.
like come up with things. So for me, I don't know if you do the same, but I'll just scroll down to the bottom of my Google Doc and just make like a quick couple word note of like this story, because I don't want to forget it if it's a good point, but I also don't want it to derail everything I'm doing right then. So just make a quick note to kind of dump it out of your head, and then you can go back, come back to it later.
So this next step, or point number 4, kind of goes with what we just said, but I want to emphasize this, is that is for shoot for as many stories as possible and make note of the type of stories that could work. So for a lot of people, for some people, you can be more inclined of like, let me just give you an information dump, which is not transformational. It can bore people.
Yeah.
And what you could be saying is true, but if it's not real, then it's just not going to connect. And so I would, even if you don't have them at the moment, for like all your points, story about blank, an intro story, a closing story, don't be shy, because what I found is people don't do this enough. And so you don't have to have a story everywhere. So like in my sermon, I might be like story about this, story for this, and I'll erase them when it comes week of to go over the sermon, because I don't need one for everything. But if you make notes for more than you need, at least some of them will stick, especially if you talk through with someone, which we'll talk about here in a second. Personal stories are always the best. What sometimes I'll write is, I need a story about a time I did blank. Now, obviously, Brian doesn't know about a time I did blank, but he might think of a time in his life when he did it, and he might say something or make me think of whatever. He might bring to mind something that I did. So even though it's my story, having some other people look at it is helpful. And so just make notes of the story or the illustration or the type of story that you want, and then go back and try to fill in the blanks or fill it in later if you think about them.
Yep. Yeah, I don't have much to add to that one. I mean, I think as many stories as possible is good. I think it's, especially if you're preaching every week, it's going to be rare that you have too many stories in a sermon, because you're doing this every week and like you use them. And
Yep.
so I would err on the side of accidentally having too many, because they, as you're editing and as you're talking through with people, you may end up taking some out, or you may
Yep.
end up deciding they don't fit. And so, yeah, as many as you can fit in, I think is good. And most likely, in most cases, I don't think it's going to actually translate to having too many in a
Yeah,
sermon.
and some are good and some are better than others, and some are not that great. And
Yeah.
so having multiple to choose from, then you can take some out, and it's like, oh, that one's not that great. Like, take it out, and it's fine because you've got other ones that work better.
Yep.
So shoot for many stories as possible. Point five, step five also goes with the sermon process, but I want to emphasize this. Once the sermon is written with points, as we've kind of already mentioned, then and a closing, then you go back and figure out the intro. So again, I think as you were experiencing your first time, a lot of people, like, you have the Bible and you have the blank piece of paper, and you don't even know how to start.
Yeah.
And the way to quickly start is just to read the passage, start making notes, start to try to figure out, what it's saying, what are some points, and without trying to figure out the beginning and how it's all going to work together
Yep.
right away. Because after you start working through, then you can kind of see some themes, or you can go back and do an intro story. But the way to start is like I would say, just don't feel like you got to know what you're going to say
Mm.
all up front, because if you're studying it and taking notes and reading, you can't know everything in the beginning anyway until you spend some time working on it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think this is, if you have someone, obviously, if you're newer, hopefully this is helpful. But if you have someone that's newer, not that this is going to solve all their problems, but have them listen to this and take some of these notes down, because these are things that the first time we did, I mean, it was my first time prepping one. I was one of our first people going through it. It's like, no, we are all figuring it out. It's whatever. But it's very easy to accidentally fall into, I have a good story, so let's see if I can fit that in.
Yeah.
I have it, and especially if you're not like a preaching every week, to where, like, if preaching every week, if you have a good story, it'll probably fit in somewhere sometime down the road. You can file it away for later.
Yeah.
But if you're like just starting, or if it's like someone's first time preaching, you want it to be good. And if you have like a really engaging story, or story that will connect with people well, you can unconsciously want to, you can want to include it so badly that you'll accidentally end up like shoehorning it in,
Yeah.
and it not really working, or just like, I'm starting with my own story, and then I'm gonna, hopefully I can make this text fit my story.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember the first one I prepped and gave. I mean, thankfully it wasn't on a Sunday morning. It was just to like a handful of people, and I don't remember what the story was. I wish I did, but I remember it was very easy to go into that, because the way we did it, we just kind of, it was like, choose whatever text you want. And I was like, I don't know. So if I have a good story, maybe I can find a text that fits a story, and which is not what you want to do. But so yeah, if the stories and stuff come later, but I think it's really easy for newer or younger guys to fall into that. Like, I want to be engaging, so let me come up with something engaging, and then hopefully I can make the text engaging from that.
Yep. So hopefully that's helpful. Your intro could be the last thing.
Yeah.
It's not that you don't have an idea of where the sermon's going, but in terms of like a story and a way to start, we mentioned on other episodes, saying, hey, just open up your Bibles and read to this and start reading the text. It's probably not the best. Now, I think many people do it because they've heard well-known preachers do it who are very gifted, and so they can do that. Now, I'm not saying if your tradition or your service is like you read all the passage up front. Like, I'm not saying don't do that if that's what you do, or maybe you have someone else read it and then you come up and preach. But I'm saying when your sermon time actually starts, it's like a couple of years ago on a podcast, John Acuff was talking about not preaching but just public speaking, and he's like, when you go to a rock concert, they don't like say, hey, everybody, we're so-and-so.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us. We're so glad to be here. Today we're going to do a set on this. Like, no, they have like smoke and lights, and they go into it, and it's high energy, and it's obviously speaking is different than, a rock concert. But you start with something engaging, and then you can introduce yourself. You can thank people for coming. But start with a story or something to engage people, to give people a reason to keep looking or keep listening. Don't start your sermon with announcements, please.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Don't start with announcements, because the first 2 minutes is the only time everybody's listening to you. And if you bore them with that, if that's what your church flow really does, maybe have someone else do the announcements and not you, so that they can be bored by someone else and still listen to you. You'll still lose a little bit of them because You just did announcements.
Yeah.
But anyway, start with something engaging, but figure that out last after you've figured out the text.
And that's a good point about that. There are, like, I was listening to someone recently who started off just by reading the text, and I was like, man, just by like saying like open up with us to whatever passage. And I was like, man, he didn't start with the story and just jumped right in. And then I realized after a few minutes, like, oh, he's like better than 99% of preachers in the world. Like you said, like there's some kind of more, more established or whatever pastors that can do this sort of thing because they're really engaging speakers, which I'm sure we all are, but we're not, and we're trying to, get better at it and things like that. But don't take what like the 1% of like the best communicators sometimes in the world and try and emulate what they do, because you are not that and I'm not that, and that's okay. But that's why we give these things. It's to help engage people and to not just assume that if we just copy what someone else does, then we're going to get the same results.
Yeah. So a friendly reminder, these are just suggestions. You can do whatever you want. It's
Yep.
not right or wrong, just what we would advise.
Mhm.
So the sixth step here, this is kind of, I don't know if this is necessarily in order, out of order. Let me explain to you my timeline, and then you can, Brian can ask any questions, or you could clarify it and that sort of thing too, of how it works. And so typically about 4 to 6 weeks out. So on Wednesday, I will do a sermon for wherever we're at. And I'll do all the stuff we talked about: prep, reading, notes, stories, all that sort of thing. And then that's done for that. And then at some point, not week of, but the week before or 2 to 3 weeks before I actually give it, depending on like if someone was out of town or whatever, but it's not week of, we'll do what we call a message collab. You could call it whatever you want. And we get some people and we talk through. It's looked different for different staff members throughout New City's history.
Yeah.
Now there's 3 of us, Brian, and then a woman at New City who's not on staff. She comes and us 3 talk through it. And we do it on a Monday. I mean, it doesn't really matter what day you do it on, because again, it's not the sermon I'm preaching that week. So I could do it anytime. We just do it on Mondays. And they've got my Google sheet, and I just talk through my sermon and I explain some things, and they listen. And then after that, we go through from the beginning, and they'll make notes as I'm going or whatever, and we'll talk through what was confusing. If something needs to be reworded, we'll talk about the illustrations where I talk about in this story about this. They'll say if anything was confusing, or if there's anything that they might want to, that they know about the passage, so that historically or contextually that they think is interesting that I don't mention, and they'll mention that. But it is really, really helpful. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes. And it's not like I'm preaching the whole thing. I'm like reading it, so it goes a little bit quicker. And I'm going to preach it differently than I read it. So it's not like, it's a little bit different. But anyway, it's just really helpful to do that. And so let's do the message collab, which we can talk about that in a second. I guess we should, because I don't really have it as a point. And then, it's been talked through. And then week of, what it looks like for me when, the sermon that I'm preaching that week is Monday morning. Again, I do it the same time every week, whatever works for you. But Monday morning, I don't go over out loud my sermon, but I take my Google Doc and I condense some of my notes. I use Notes Pro on my iPad. So I actually, the notes for the scripture, I'll actually write by hand. So I'll put the Bible passage in the Notes Pro app, and then I'll write by hand notes on the verses. And I do that because it forces me to condense them, because I'm not going to write everything I type, because that would take forever. So it forces me to condense them. So it gets all of that. Oh, pro tip: before I reduce my notes on a Monday morning, I didn't do this in the beginning, but I learned this like 2 years ago. I copy and paste everything. Or copy everything and paste it below, so that when I end up, because all that I end up with is an outline at the end of the day, and then I lose all my notes.
Yep.
So if I ever want to Google something or look in my drive for something, I'm like, what did I say about that? My outline is not there. So copy everything before you erase it, and keep it in the same doc. Just put it below it. And so I'll take all my notes out of there. If there's a question on Monday, if there's a question about the wording of a point, I'll settle on the wording, settle on my stories. And I won't talk through it out loud, but it's condensed. My notes are there. I've got an idea of what I'm going to do. And then Tuesday morning and Thursday morning, I talk through it out loud. And if there's anything else, like typically, like I'll have some notes on my outline, like under my points for things I want to say. I'll erase some of those and do the minimum, and do that. And then Thursday morning, I go over it again. After I go over it on Thursday, I print out my iPad notes and put them in the Bible, and I double check on ProPresenter to make sure all the notes are right, because our worship guy on Wednesday inputs all of my sermon notes into the computer. So if I for ProPresenter, so if I have changed anything, I'll go double check with that, and yeah, then it's done. And then
Yep.
I don't really look at it again. Sunday morning, I'll look over about 20 minutes at my house because at our space here, there's my office is right next to the auditorium, so it's really loud. So I'll
Yeah.
look over the sermon. I kind of pretty much I like talk through it in my head, which you can talk in your head really fast. And so I kind of on Sunday morning, and that's what that looks like. And so the week of again Monday morning, reduce my notes. Long story short, Tuesday and Thursday go over it out loud, and Sunday preach it. Now how this works for us for Sunday, just for what it's worth. So the only thing I take up with me typically is my Bible and my notes on the scripture. Sometimes I'll have a printout if there's like quotes because I don't want to read them from the screen. I like to look down. Or if there was like a historical context that was just I needed to get it right and I couldn't write it in my Bible because it's too long and I wouldn't remember it. So
Yeah.
I might have like we've been in Nahum. So yesterday I had something about I don't know, something historically happening in Nineveh because there's no way if I can remember it.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'll do. I might do that once, bring something like that up with me. But that's about it. And then we do the points. And so on our screens, just for Sunday morning, this isn't new if you've been listening to us. If like we were in Nahum recently, and so on the screen it would say the Nahum chapter 1 verses 1 through 19, or chapter 3 verses 1 through 19. That was this past Sunday, and then the page number. So the main scripture is not on the screen. We have Bibles and all the seat backs, so that makes it possible. So people will turn there. We've got an episode on why we do that, so I won't get all into that here, but I highly recommend it if you can put Bibles in all the seats.
Yeah, if possible.
If there's any supporting texts that aren't in Nahum that I wanted to reference, we do put those on the screen so that people don't have to flip there. But it'll just be that, and then my points will come on the screen, so I don't necessarily have to have them with me because on the back of our auditorium there's a screen that says the current slide and the slide that's coming up, so I can see what's coming up. And for some of the points, I'll have. This is where it gets a little complicated. You may or may not be able to track with this. I'll have notes that I want to say, so it keeps me from having to bring up an outline. But on the next slide on ProPresenter, there'll be like an asterisk with like a couple of words or whatever, something like a story to remind me, but isn't shown on the screen.
Yeah.
And so on the screen on the back of the auditorium, I see the current point. I see any couple of notes that I want to make sure I emphasize, and then we just click over it to go to the next screen.
Yeah.
And so again, this is you might not be able to track with this, but it's got I do it at asterisk so that I know it's like a note slide, not like an actual slide. And then the last thing I'll put like a slash, and I'll put like Nahum 7, which shows me we're going to Nahum verse 7 next. Or if it's a point back to back, and my little note screen, it'll be a slash, and then in all caps it'll say the next point, so that I know the next point's coming. That's confusing. Don't worry about it. Just bring an outline with you or whatever you do.
Yeah.
But that's how it gets delivered on Sunday. So
I have shared a wall with you for a long time, and I never hear you go over your messages out loud. Do you whisper? I always want to ask this, but
well,
this just
sometimes I
reminded
do it
me.
before you're here. I think that
Okay,
happens
could be,
a lot.
could be,
And
yeah.
then I don't like talk loud. Like I wouldn't talk normal voice. I typically, I unconsciously just even if when you're not here, I just kind of like I don't whisper, but it's quiet.
Just quietly. Yeah. I always go over. We have our kids' space, so I always go over there to go over it out loud because I don't want anyone hearing me. All my mess ups. But so we don't. I don't know if you want to talk about this more. We kind
any
of talked
question
about
the
it,
timeline?
No,
and then
so
we can talk
not
about
really.
it.
So
Okay.
it's Wednesday. You prep.
Ahead of
Then
time.
is it the following Monday? Is Message Club, or just kind of when it filters
when it
in?
filters in.
Yeah.
It's not always the one I just prepped. It just depends. But it's not week of, because if you do it week of, then it gets me behind on everything else.
And I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Is like not doing everything week of, because this, by default, if you followed the way we're doing, which if you want to, you can. If you did this all week of, you'd be doing like it'd be very difficult. Because there's a lot of, it's not a ton of time, but it's a lot of different things, like prepping it, then collabing it, then going over it out loud and putting it in all those different things. So I feel like if you were to try and replicate this, but also not want to get ahead, it would be stressful. I feel.
You couldn't.
Yeah.
So even if you're just a week ahead, what you could do is the week ahead of time, you could do your prep, and then maybe Monday, or maybe a later day that week after your prep. But even if it was Monday week of, you could do the message collab, and then Tuesday. I mean, I go over it. You don't have to do that, but like you could do the message collab on Monday, and then Tuesday and Wednesday, or however you want to do your review for that Sunday. Because I was at a thing a couple weeks ago, and one pastor was talking about how he doesn't get ahead. It's because he said he wants to like sit in the text all week, which I get.
Yeah.
But the way I do it, I am in the text all week because I go over it
That's
Monday,
true.
Tuesday, and Thursday,
Yep.
so I know what's happening. But it makes the Wednesday, the sermon prep time, it just makes it so much less stressful because it doesn't have to be done that week, and I know people are going to hear it. And so sometimes the message collab is pretty brief. It's like, oh, there's not much to say, which helps you know that it's not terrible. But there's typically always at least one or two things where I'm like, I don't know, but I'm going to ask for help on this because they're going to hear it. And if you're doing that all week of, it gets really complicated.
Yeah. One thing I would say is if you're regardless of what this looks like, figure out a schedule or
Yes.
a way to do this, and obviously tweak if need be, but stick to it as much as possible. And reason I say that is like when I do this, I don't preach every week, and so there's a long time where I would over prep
Yep.
and over rehearse, if that's the right word for it, where like I would, because our typically our last day in the office is Thursday, so Thursday to Sunday is kind of a gap, and so I would always be nervous that like I'd be prepped for Thursday, and then there's a couple days of not thinking about it, and then Sunday I would forget everything. And so there's a period of time where I'd come in on Fridays or Saturdays, just, I mean, I could do it from home, but we have a small house, so just so I could have some alone time to go over it. And it was nice, like I was prepared for Sunday, but I was, you know, leaving my family behind and doing all these things where like I couldn't do this if I was doing it every week, because that's time I'm not supposed to be working, and
Yeah.
but I was doing it anyways. And so within the past, I don't know, year or so, I just kind of made the decision, and nothing bad has come of it, of whatever happens by Thursday is what happens. I mean, obviously if there's some tragedy throws everything off, sure, but like that's the 1 in a million case. For the majority of the time, like if I'm going to prep as much as I need to prep for Thursday, and then that needs to be it. And so what I do, you go over it Sunday morning, Saturday night I'll take like an hour, and just after kids go to bed, I'll not really talk through it out loud, but just kind of go over it silently, like, but alone. But that's it, just kind of like a little refresher. But the times when I was coming in and just doing it as much as possible, like, man, come Sunday, I mean, who knows if the sermons were any good? Like, I felt like I knew what I was prepared. I felt good. But I found not doing that, I felt no different. Like and so all I was doing was, was wasting time, kind of. Like, not that it's a waste of time going over a message, but I think you can get in your own head of, I just need to spend as much time in this as possible. And in reality, when I've really cut that time down, I don't think that the quality, or at least my feeling towards it, my preparedness, hasn't really changed at all.
Yeah. So the point here is get in a scheduled rhythm and do it.
Yeah.
And some of this might sound really complicated and overwhelming. You know, this took years to develop. Whatever it is for you, just do it. And what we also say, we've talked about preaching on this podcast, is Sunday morning doesn't have to be your deadline. Just change your deadline. There's nothing unholy about it. Be your deadline being Thursday.
Yep.
In fact, I would argue it's probably better, because then you can actually be present with your family and take a day off when everyone else is taking a day. Like, it's just, I think it's better in a lot of reasons. And so I used to go over it Saturday night, and then I was like, I don't like going over it on Saturday night. And so that's why now I do it on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Because it's like, again, it's a review. It's not like I'm trying to write it. And so there's flexibility there. So different seasons, different things might work for you, but get in a rhythm, find one that works for you, and just start tweaking it, because you can't tweak something if it's different every single week. And so if you want to try all these, I wouldn't say try all these things at once. Just get in a rhythm and then tweak one thing at a time until you find something that really works for you. And if you give yourself deadlines, you will hit them. And prepping a sermon for 30 hours is not going to be any better than if you prepped it for 15 hours, or maybe 12 hours or 10 hours. If you're actually focused, like if you give yourself deadlines of like,
the key.
I'm going to do it at this time, I'm not going to do anything else, and it's going to be written. And so that's the timeline. The message collab, again, it's just, I just talk through it, and then we give thoughts and opinions, and it's just nice to know that other people have heard of you, heard what you're going to say. It has stopped me from saying things that I was going to say because I thought they were good, and of course, it's helped me say other things that were more clarifying. So,
and one thing we do not ask anyone who's in the message collab team, whatever, to do anything ahead of time. So they don't do any previous.
If you want, you can, but you don't have to.
Yeah. And I think it'll be a lot easier to find people that'll be willing to do this if they know that. Like, going in, I don't read his sermons at all beforehand. Like, that's my first time hearing it, because like it's tough when everyone comes with their own thoughts of where the sermon should go, because you've said this before, but like, you have to be the one that's preaching it. You have to be comfortable with where it's going. And if you're trying to kind of write in someone else's sermon almost kind of into your own, then things get a little messy. So we don't ask anybody to prep ahead of time. And it's just listen to it and give feedback. Yeah. And it makes it a lot easier to talk to people about joining the team, obviously. But also, it's a lot less cumbersome for the people that are on it to actually, this is the time allotted to it. I don't need to prep for a couple hours beforehand. And it's still really beneficial.
And you don't need people that are super smart. Because
true too.
I mean, it's helpful if they have biblical knowledge, but you're also preaching to the average person. So if something's confusing to them, it's going to be confusing to other people. And so we just talk through it. Again, people share their opinions. They don't have to study ahead of time. we've done this different ways, and we've said in the past as well. If you're preaching the sermon, again, you got to. At the end of the day, you're preaching it, so you like if you want everybody to figure out all the points together, or maybe come with like 3 points you think are in this text. It can be awkward and weird because you're not going to use all of them, and then you're saying other things that like you don't necessarily want to say. They could totally be true, but they're not like points you would use, if that makes sense. And so really, we have found this is for feedback. This is not for everyone to write what they would write if they were preaching the sermon. So that is critical just to understand going into it.
Yeah, and it's like for who we have right now, the woman that we have that's doing it with us is actually in seminary.
Yeah.
But that's the point
we've
of this
had staff in the past that wasn't. I mean, it's just people whoever's available.
Yeah, me. The point isn't like everyone bring all the knowledge that you've amassed about this and let's put our heads together and come up with a message. It's just listen through this, give me feedback. Is anything? I mean, hopefully nothing's like wrong.
Yeah.
But like if is anything am I not explaining things well? Is this confusing? It's more that kind of feedback than let's all put our heads together and hopefully we can come out with a message with all the knowledge that we've amassed about this text.
Yeah. So in my experience, 3 to 4 people is probably the best, maybe 5 if everyone can stay on track. But anything more than that, it would take forever and that sort of thing. So that's the timeline.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, the ancillary stuff that goes with the sermon. So the last step is to figure out. So we do sermon-based community group leader guides, and so what happens for us is I write those on Tuesday. So on Monday I go over the sermon. I reduce my notes. Tuesday I go over the sermon. Now, granted, I'm still going to go over the sermon again on Thursday and like tighten anything up. So it's not like 100% done, but all of the main stuff is like I know what the sermon's about. The only really point that's in the community group leader guide is the last point, and I can edit that on Thursday if I need to.
Yeah, true.
We actually did. Gosh, I didn't look up the number. Somewhat within the last 6 episodes, we did our community group leader guide.
Yeah,
breakdown.
very recent.
So it's very recent. You should scroll back if not. We talk exactly how we write it, so I'm not going to do it here. But again, since we're sermon based, it helps us that to be ahead. Brian will send them out on Thursdays, and so again, I think one of the things that's helpful about being scheduled in rhythm and even ahead is to realize that you're not the only one dependent on the sermon. Now, if you're a small church and it's like one worship leader and you, that might be different. But as things grow and maybe become more complex, your staff will be a lot more appreciative if they can all plan things, as opposed to waiting for you on Saturday night.
Yep.
And so that happens on Wednesday. Kevin takes the sermon and puts it in ProPresenter and all that sort of thing. Again, I'm still going to go over it on Thursday one more time, but it's a lot easier for me to tweak one thing, if anything, than put it all in. We also, because we're ahead, this isn't on here, but we pick the songs. So Kevin usually picks the songs about 2 weeks ahead of time. He's not in the sermon prep process right now because he's got another job during the day, so he can't.
Yeah.
But it was really helpful. So if your worship leader could be a part of it, it's also really helpful because then they can hear about it. So he reads through all of them though, and he will pick songs that go with it. I will, because he's not in the sermon collab right now, I will often, if there's a song, because we do 2 songs before, 2 songs after, and they're not all going to go with it, but typically the songs after we really want to if we can.
Yeah.
So I'll like make a note of like a song like this, or maybe even suggest a song in our song bank. It's totally up to him if he wants to use it. It's not at all. But if there's something I think would go well, I like put a note in the Google Doc for him to know that maybe pick a song that talks about this or whatever. But he's able to do that and ahead of time. And then, like I said, Thursday I go over it. I print out the outline for our screens person and for our live stream so that they have it on Sunday morning. It's just, even though it's the same thing that's in the computer, it's just really helpful to have it in front of them. And I also can make a note like, hey, I'm going to be quick on this point, so go quick or whatever, something like that. Or the live stream, I can say, make sure you put this up on the live stream or something like that.
Yep.
And then I'm done. And then I review it Sunday morning and then preach it.
And that's it. Like you said, like staying ahead is not just helpful to yourself; it's helpful to everybody. Like I always see posts in Facebook groups and stuff about like
the pastors
Saturday night sending stuff or got to make changes. We don't do a bulletin, but like making changes to that or to the points. Like, dude, we would just say no. It's happening. Whatever we said is going to happen. But like, or like if something has like a point has to change or something. Dylan obviously has the ability to go and change it himself in ProPresenter, or I don't know that we ever had to do this, but maybe our message notes, they might be a little off.
Well, we didn't say it. So Brian prints those on Thursday.
Yeah.
So we do fill in the blanks. Not everyone takes them, but if they want the message on the screen, it's like the color, and then there's like 1 or 2 words that are a different color, and they can fill in the blank. So Brian prints those on Thursday so that we don't have to reprint them. And typically it's fine. Maybe once in the past 4 years I've changed something, but it's
Yeah.
very rare.
Yeah.
And so Sunday, so we go ahead and do that ahead of time too, so you're not worried about it on Sunday.
And that's really helpful to know when things are going to be done. So like I do the message notes, print them and cut them and stuff like that on Thursday around noon. I send out the community group leader guide Thursday around noon. And so I know every Thursday around noon it's going to be done. And if it wasn't, Dylan would tell me, but that's never happened, you know? And so we just have that kind of understanding because we're in a routine of when to do things that every week I don't need to be going to him and saying, is it done yet? We wait an hour and it kind of throws everything else I had scheduled off.
Yep.
But it's like, I know it's going to be done this time because we said it would be. And so far we've stuck to our word. And so it is. And so it helps you, obviously not with a number of things like we've said, but especially even if you don't have a staff now, it's just a good habit to get into now so that down the road, you're not trying to change things when you bring people on board and start passing some of these things off.
Yeah. So again, this might sound complicated and complex and overwhelming. This is years in the making, but I would say start getting into a rhythm now, and then you can start to figure out some of these things of like when we're going to pick songs, if we do a sermon-based group, when that's going to be done, if we're going to do a handout or something, and we don't want to print out on Sunday morning, particularly if you're portable or something happens with the printer, you know, that could be a bummer to do it at a time. Start just making a rhythm, and then you can add and tweak things as you go.
Yep, exactly.
That's our 7-step sermon prep process all over the place for you.
It might have been like 30 steps.
But hopefully, again, the point is just to hear what other people are doing, and then you can take it or leave it and go from there. If you have questions, you can reach out to us on our website, practicalplanting.com, or even easier on the Facebook group. If you're not in the Facebook group, Practical Church Planting, join the group. Ask any questions about preaching. A lot of other people will chime in as well. People ask about preaching all the time. It's really cool to see people interact. And so you can join the Facebook group. I think we just passed the 1,700 people mark. So that's pretty cool. So you can join that and ask questions as well. And as we said in the beginning, if you're 12 months or less from launching, or you're curious about planting a church, and you want not just raise money and meet with people, but actually how to do it, practicalplanting.com/launch. We have our Growing Our Launch Team course that we created last year, and super highly practical, just like this was. And so, that's our prep process. Thanks for being with us, and we'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.